Please welcome to the stage USGLC board member Selena Jackson.
Good morning. I'm Selena Jackson of Procter & Gamble, and I'm a proud member of the USGLC Board of Directors. I'm honored to introduce our next conversation, which is driving America's economic competitiveness. We're going to discuss how the United States, together with the private sector and companies like P&G, where we can harness the economic, security, and diplomatic tools to open and stabilize emerging global markets and remain strategically competitive around the world. Joining us for this conversation are four special guests. Alice Albright is the CEO of the Millennium Challenge Corporation. She brings to this role 30 years of international experience in the private, nonprofit, and public sectors. She also served as the CEO of the Global Partnership for Education and the Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer of the Ex-Im Bank. Dr. Jay Shambaugh is the Undersecretary for International Affairs at the Treasury Department, where he oversees international economic policies regarding the World Bank, IMF, G7, and G20, and also subjects around exchange rates, climate, and financial regulation. He's currently on leave as a professor of economics and international affairs at the George Washington University. He's also a proud Fletcher graduate like myself. Candy Wolf is the Executive Vice President and Head of Global Government Affairs at Citi. Candy served during the administration of George W. Bush as Assistant to the President for Legislative Affairs. Candy also serves as the co-chair of USGLC's Board of Directors. Moderating the conversation is someone I met like 35 years ago, is Steve Clements, who joins us from the really new and cool Semaphore, which is today's media partner, and he serves there as the founding editor-at-large. Please join me in welcoming Alice, Jay, Candy, and Steve.
Thank you, Selena, and thanks for aging at least me in this. Hey, it's great to be with all of you, and Semaphore is very, very happy to be today's media sponsor. You know, I've been writing about and engaged with USGLC for what I feel is decades. I mean, I think it's one of the most important organizations dealing with a question which we're going to get into right now in American engagement in the world and what the terms of it are. And I really commend all of you for taking this subject so seriously and the role you play in this, or hopefully you pay if you're not. If you're on the sidelines, get in. But when I start out, you know, and we've got a fantastic panel here, and we're going to have a chat. And then go to a few of you. But you know, when I was looking at this is not a bland topic. This is a topic that is highly important on looking at American engagement in the world. And I want to start with you, Jay, and just say, you know, the global economy is, you know, predicted to go through a real slump here when you kind of look at the global economic data and predictions. And when you compare that to sort of how some of our other peer competitors in the world, China, are positioning themselves in the world, I guess my question is, when I talk to US policymakers, they either come in with a strong degree of confidence about Americans' portfolio and engagement in the world, and there is no wrong. So it's the posture of confidence. And I'm wondering if we ought to have a posture of concern. And whether or not we are not meeting the targets we should, that this should be something our hair is on fire about. Because if you are in a posture of confidence, I'm just wondering, are we doing enough? So I'd be interested, as you share your perspective on how the global economic climate is affecting American engagement, are you concerned or are you confident?
So I'm an economist by training, so I'm always concerned. That's just my standard posture. That being said, when I think about the global economy, and in particular the U.S. role in the global economy, I think I do come from a position of confidence. I think when I look, I think as Secretary Yellen said in her speech about the U.S.-China relationship, the demise of the U.S. economy has been predicted many, many, many times, and there have been various countries that were going to overtake us and make us irrelevant, and all of those predictions have been wrong, and I don't think there's any clear reason why you'd think otherwise right now. Frankly, when you just look at what the U.S. strengths are long term, again, medium and long term. If we're talking about business cycle fluctuations and what's going to happen in one country versus another, that's a forecasting game that I don't know that we need to get into here. But I think the gist of your question of should we have confidence as U.S. policymakers about the U.S. role in the global economy, I think there the answer is yes. Just we have the strongest education system and innovation system, and I think those are the things that are the best structure in terms of rule of law and things like that, and really strong alliances around the world.
So let me just interrupt you there, but put yourselves in a African leader's shoes for a moment. Not the United States projecting how great we are, but you're looking at that African leader weighing options. Do they go and get in a debt trap with China? Do they hang out and wait for America to pay them attention? As you're looking at the developing world, which so much of this conference is about, are we affecting the calculations of those leaders in Africa or the global South that what you just said matters and touches them?
Yeah, I think it's on two fronts. I think on the one hand, I'd say if you ask yourself, where would you rather do business? I think unquestionably the answer is with us, right? I think they want to trade with us. They want to sell us goods. They want foreign investment from the United States. They know foreign investment from the United States or from the international financial institutions comes in a high standards way that is built to be a partner to them, not an exploitive relationship. I think they understand that. We took a 10-day sweep through Africa with the secretary early at the start of this year, and that was very clear from our conversations that we were there as a partner, we wanted to be there as a partner, and they understood that. I think on the flip side of your question, does China play a big role in parts of Africa? It does, and I think that sometimes suggests, there hasn't been enough funding coming, whether it's from the international financial institutions or from foreign direct investment, and it's left countries sometimes looking for other options. But I think if you ask them which they prefer, if both were on the table, I think our deal is a better deal. And I'd honestly say, I think when you say have we left it open, I think you look at what MCC does. They're all over Africa. If you look at Power Africa, it's all over Africa. If you look at PEPFAR, we're there as a partner and doing a lot of important work.
Alice, I'd love to talk about what MCC is doing to be there. Millennium Challenge Corporation, of course, is part of America's toolkit in addressing global development down there. A few years back, I moderated a dinner with Bono, and he said, we're doing a lot behind the scenes, but nobody sees Made in America on it. They do see a lot of Made in China products. And while we're not talking about products, we're talking about systems and private-public partnerships and the tools you have. I'd love to get a sense of whether you're concerned or confident, given your toolkit, that we have enough to make an impact on the development vector of the Global South.
Well, thank you, and let me thank USGLC for hosting this. What a great event. I always love coming to USGLC events. I'm going to take a slightly different tack from the Undersecretary. When I look at the conditions in many of the countries that we work in, I am concerned. I think that a lot of COVID, climate, economic shifts, inflation, the list goes on, has had a very devastating impact on many of the partners that we have. Now, the good news is that MCC is a very strong tool. I do think we can do more of MCC. Just for those who don't know us, we've been in business for 20 years. We are a grant maker. That stands in stark contrast to what China is doing, which is often acting as a lender. We provide grant financing in the hundreds of millions of dollars to critical sectors that are the biggest challenges that a country has. We work very closely with countries on making sure that where we're deploying our grant dollars is where they think their strategic challenges are. So we've got a great tool, but we can do more. And we've got a lot of work ahead of us in terms of making sure that we're addressing where the real challenges are. One thing that's very much on our mind in the Do More department is legislation that is up in front of the Hill. And I know that you all are heading up to the Hill shortly. And I would welcome you to advocate for this. We have a piece of legislation on the Hill. I want to thank all the congressmen and senators. They're already very much in support of it. Chairman Risch, for example, Chairman Menendez, folks in the House. What this piece of legislation does is it essentially expands our geographic footprint from currently the 81 lowest income countries in the world to 115. And there's two pieces to take away from that. One is that it will enable us to continue to work in all of our partner countries where they are eligible to try to alleviate poverty and boost economic growth. And that's really what our mission is. But there's also good news for us here at home. by developing these long-term, trusted, open, transparent relationships. It creates stability for us as a foreign policy matter. It creates opportunity for businesses here in the States to get involved. You talked about Made in America. We do work with businesses to try to figure out where our grant funding coincides with what people are interested in. So it's a terrific tool. There's more that needs to be done, and I think we have to be very much aware of what is ahead of us, because there's an uphill climb in helping a lot of our partners alleviate poverty.
So if you get 82 countries expanding to 115, do you get a 50% jump in your budget and assets?
I'm going to say I hope so, but we will work within the footprint that we have.
I mean, do you have enough assets with a footprint that large in these developing countries to do the job you need, or do you need a bigger pot?
Well, we can always do more with more. What we have done since we were created in 2004, I think speaks volumes about what we can do with the funding that we've had. We've deployed over $15 billion in 46 countries, in 74 different compacts and thresholds, which are the names of our programs, and we've helped 270 million people recover from some form of poverty.
Right.
So we are what I would call a highly efficient mechanism. Our administrative budget is in the neighborhood of $115, $130 million a year. And when you think about what we're able to do with that funding year on year, with our grant funding, it's a substantial track record. So we can do more with more, and I think that it will help us build the types of relationships that you've talked about, Jay, abroad, but it also helps create opportunities for us here at home.
Thank you. Look, I'm probably going to get in trouble with this comment, Candy and my friends in the panel. I think there's a selflessness in a lot of what we're discussing today. I'd like to talk about the national selfishness and self-interest in global engagement. And one of the things that has boggled my mind is watching the Belt and Road Initiative around the world grow, take hold, see the financial relationships, look at the investment, as America seemed to do very little in response. And now we have the G7 Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment Policy, or investment, Candy, and a $600 billion commitment to basically try and catch up. And I'm wondering if I'm framing it the right way, because when I look at that, if it were to succeed and we were to basically bring in new, significant, large-scale investment that tie nations and their interests together with the U.S. and its key allies in the developed world, then I look at that as power. I look at that as America having a beneficial impact on where the globe is going and changing. What I always say, we're changing the weather for the good. But I worry if we're too passive, we don't do it. So that's the self-interest part of this. And I'm just wondering if you could walk us through your role and Citi's role, and as you kind of look at the private-public world behind this new G7 initiative, whether it's real.
Well, maybe step back for a minute and go back to what the Undersecretary was saying earlier. Look, American investment is still, America is a place where people want to invest. But what we got to show the strength is America's willingness to invest in the world. Mm-hmm. And the challenge is you've got one set of tools that the U.S. government has available to it, but it's limited. It's not Belt and Road. It's not sort of, we can argue whether China has unlimited dollars these days, but it seems like there's more unlimited dollars that you can put in public investment. It's really hard in a democracy to decide where the funding's going to go. So what do you have to do? You have to leverage. And that means there's sort of two different efforts. One is the efforts that the G7 has had, because you got to pull allies together, right? If you pool the money, you've got more resources. The numbers look bigger, and you can allocate it more effectively. But then you've got to catalyze the private sector. There's a lot more dollars in the private sector than there is in the private sector. Than in the public sector. But in order to leverage that money, there's different, there's things that have to get done. And my CEO, Citi CEO, Jane Fraser, was at the G7. We were asked to speak about, private sector leveraging. And I think there's some practical things that have to get done. right? And so we can talk about how it's great that we're going to catalyze the private sector, but I think we've got to turn it into reality. And reality means a couple of things. One, there's a lot of reforms that the administration has undertaken with Secretary Yellen around changing the multi-development banks and the structure, right? You can't take the same institutions that have been doing financing the same way for decades and try to apply it to the problems that exist today. And you've got to be able to make changes to those organizations. So I think one is to try to get that development reform and reforms through. But those reforms are long-term, okay? They're not short-term. They're going to take time. So you need some short-term fixes. There's some things that the private sector, we're really good at capital markets. Okay, that's what we do. Banks manage capital markets. Development banks don't manage capital markets. They get lending. And so we need to have a dialogue. There's some things as simple as bringing the technocrats in and understanding what are the constraints that exist in certain development banks today and how they can finance and how you can catalyze the private sector through things like capital markets. And it's, to be honest, there's never been a roundtable conversation where people are sitting down and you bring different banks and different private sectors, whether it's Japan or whether it's, the EU or elsewhere, and you just come in and you say, let's talk about how we solve some of this. And I think the only other point is there's data, there's information, right? Private sector is going to invest if it's worth investing in it. Okay, it's got to be, it's good, but you also have to make it investable.
Right.
And meaning investable means you got to understand what are the risks and what's the data that you have. And there's data that's available in the federal government that we also think should be made available to the private sector.
So maybe this is a naive question, and I apologize for my ignorance in advance, but it seems to me that the part of the world that Alice is talking about is a part of the world where capital markets may be a distant dream, and maybe I'm wrong. I mean, I spent a lot of time, I hosted a lunch 2 weeks before Ajay Banga was announced as our nominee for the World Bank. So the lunch had everything to do with it, I'm sure. But Ajay was here basically to talk about the Partnership for Central America. And he was meeting Vice President Kamala Harris and others after this. And if anybody is involved, and I get the numbers right, I apologize. I think they've raised about $4.5 billion of private sector money to come down in the Central American area to try to root jobs, and create sticky economies that basically are more responsive to the population in need and really deal with some of our southern border problems by stabilizing economies and investing in them. And he told me what a big lift it was. And we organized a luncheon, Semaphore did, where I brought in people from other war-stressed and conflict-stressed regions around the world to see if there was any opportunity in the models. And so when you kind of talk to these folks, maybe capital markets is the answer, but I'm just wondering in these parts of the world where there's so much stress, de-investment, lack of investment, how do we deal with that? Because that's really what I think USGL sees. How does America have an impact? Maybe capital markets is the answer for that, but I'm just wondering, are there other steps?
I'm
saying?
Maybe Jay's going to comment, because I think
sure.
there's,
I mean, I do think the MDB Evolution Project is part of this, right? And I think trying to take really seriously what we mean by private sector capital mobilization. And, I don't think it's an accident that Ajay Banga was nominated, right? I mean, he was chosen for a reason. I think he's, if you can very credibly say he is someone who can think about how to bring the private sector together with what the MDBs are doing. But I think it goes beyond that. I think it's also, and it really goes back to almost to your first question as well, Steve, about, concern versus confidence. I think confidence doesn't mean you're done, right? It says, let's go and be really aggressive here. And part of that is leading with PGII. Part of it is trying to pull the private sector in. Part of it is trying to make sure you're using your tools as effectively as possible and merging those things. And so, the MDB Evolution Project, some of it I agree is longer term, but some can hit really quickly. So, we tried very hard to make sure we were able to harvest as quickly as possible low-hanging fruit. And so, in April, 6 months after the Secretary first gave her speech, we had reforms passed that will open up an extra $50 billion over 10 years in headroom at the World Bank.
Right.
That's real money. That's almost as big as the last time they did a capital increase. Like, this is real money on the table, but also changes around incentives, changes around operations to make sure they can work with the private sector better, to make sure they can pull in other capital better, to make sure that they're not duplicating but actually doubling up the efforts that are going on. And so I really think there's lots more room to use the banks, there's room to use PGII, and the one thing I would say, though, when you say about the capital markets being absent in some of these countries, when we were in Zambia in January, this is an incredibly poor country going through a terrible debt distress situation, stuck under, realistically, owing money to China and China not being willing yet to come to the table firmly enough to deal with that debt distress. But we were meeting with entrepreneurs. They're still trying to raise capital. They're still trying to start businesses. We met a lot of great business owners there. So I don't think even in the poorest countries you find an absence of a desire for borrowing and investment. It's a question of how stood up are the markets, how hard is it to bring in the private sector, and can you do enough to deal with things like debt distress to make sure the private sector can really leap forward.
Yeah, so that's fascinating. So Alice, I think one of the things that helps a group like this as they're up talking to legislators about why expansion of your program is important is to have human stories of the differences you've made. Do you have a kind of favorite story about the impact of MCC and its toolkit on the development vector of things? Is there something you can share with us? Which child is your favorite of your various initiatives?
I don't know where to start. How much time do we have? Let me come back just a little bit to the question we were just talking about, which is that the whole subject of bringing private capital in, capital markets, international capital markets, local capital markets, development banks, U.S. agencies, it's a very nuanced picture, and we probably should have another conversation about how you actually bring all of that together, because there's a lot of there. On the stories, let me tell you about my last trip, which was to Morocco. MCC has invested over $1 billion in Morocco in 2 compacts going back about 15 years. I was just there viewing a lot of the projects that we've done. Our work there includes everything from land reform, where we've helped the government give land titles for the first time to men and women farmers, which then enable them to take those titles and actually borrow to develop their businesses. I had lunch next to a wonderful woman who's now going to be able to send her kids to school.
So they were not previously titled, or they were owned by the king?
It was a more complicated process that did not allow individual land titles.
Interesting.
And that's a common theme in the countries we work in, is the absence of land titling. So it's a problem. We also see it in Zambia, and where you all just were, we see it in Lesotho. We also saw that country develop some significant industrial zones, which will help attract businesses of all different kinds to set up shop in Morocco. There was all kinds of work done on agriculture. I mean, there's a range of things. Another terrific example is also in Lusaka as well, which is I met with a woman who now has water to her house because of work that MCC has done. And when she met with me, she came out of her house and she said, water is life, and you've changed my life. So we can look, we've got stories that are sort of from individuals that we've worked with. We've also we've transformed sectors. In many of the sectors we do energy work, we have multiplied the energy capacity in that country. We have built hundreds of kilometers of roads. We've completely transformed port capacity. I'm going to Benin in a couple of weeks. We've completely transformed the port and energy capacity in that country. We just signed a $500 million arrangement, our first one that's regional between Benin and Niger. It's going to build a trade corridor from Cotonou, which is the port in Benin, up to Niamey, which is the capital of Niger, which is landlocked, to completely transform how goods flow. We're working on a significant investment in Sierra Leone, which will, by multiples, improve the whole electricity grid in that country. So these are not only sectoral examples, but they're going to impact the lives of people. I've met with people in Sierra Leone who can't start businesses because the energy system is intermittent. So we can make, where we really concentrate on the key sectors, we bring in the private sector, we figure out what the big challenge is, we can make a huge difference. And we've talked a number of times on the panel about China. Let me make one really important point.
Right.
Our money is grant money. It does not have to be repaid. It does not carry an interest rate. It does not have a cash collateral account with it. It is grant money, and it is structured to address the problems that the countries think are the biggest problems.
And real quick, and I'm going to jump to Candy, if I'm Senator Jim Risch and you're telling me that, or someone in the audience is talking to me, and I ask you, What does that do for the American brand? Or, is there a sense that America helped make this happen? Does the public know? What's your answer?
Absolutely, they know. The countries that we work in know exactly that it's the United States that have helped them through MCC, and we see that every time we get on the ground. From a foreign policy perspective, it helps us build stability, trusted relationships, transparency in our engagement with countries. We also work on all manner of areas of reform that helps improve the enabling environment for U.S. businesses to come in. So there are benefits for us. Whoops, that was bad on my microphone. There are benefits for us as the United States in terms of our foreign policy goals, and there are benefits for our partners.
Thank you. And Candy, we're going to go to the audience in just a second, but I want to ask you about something. I guess one of my things I often get in trouble with, I'm not a big fan of sanctions. I'm not a big fan of unilateral sanctions in particular, but I find sanctions often ineffective. They're emotional, but not necessarily effective. I get why we have them, but when you throw a pandemic onto it, you throw sanctions policy onto it, you then throw a lot of money into economy, you get a lot of inflation, you have a lot of things that happen. And one of the things that came undone, was supply chain, drove up costs. You had a lot of things break down. And I've been asking myself, whether it's sanctions, which also affects, supply chain, during crisis and creates squeezes on, everything you need. I'm just wondering, in terms of you have a macro result of a lot of micro actions. Do you have any insights from your perspective of thinking about financing, global infrastructure, and some of these issues, how we can right that ship, or at least, get the system back into a healthy way? Because we now have what I would call a very wobbly globalization. Globalization used to mean high trust networks. You trusted the movement of ideas, institution, people, money. Now we have connectivity but high fear and uncertainty. And I'm just wondering how you're going to fix that.
Well, that's an easy
In
question,
about 2
and
minutes.
it should be turned over to some of the other panelists. But look, I think as being one of the most global banks, we spend a lot of time thinking about what the frictions are in that global economy, and whether it's COVID or geopolitics that have created a lot of that friction. It's there, right? Whether governments are very nationalistic, populistic. We're all doing industrial policy these days, and so I think we're living in the moment of what is the new globalization. Right? And it hasn't sorted itself out yet. In the world of disruption, it's still being disrupted. And, so is there a fix? I think it's sort of where it's going to settle. It's hard to know because if you look at corporations, banks, we like certainty. We want as much certainty as possible. If we understand what the rules are, we can figure it out. But when you don't know what the rules are, it's a lot harder. The China tensions make it really difficult,
right?
Particularly, and and I think friction. What I worry about from an America greatness is, and maybe it's just the capitalist in me, but it's very much this notion that if we're restricting the flow of capital in many different ways, then are we getting to a point where we restrict innovation in the U.S.?
Right.
And what makes us great is our innovation. It's the ability of that capital to flow to where it needs to flow and to have the creative ideas. And I see it at the states that are restricting the flow of capital in the U.S., right? There's some states you can do business. There's red states. There's becoming blue states. The politics are sort of taking over on a lot of these topics, and I think, I worry that if we're going to be strong and whether we're going to compete with China on chips and the rest, we should just be in with, making sure that our innovation and that our markets are strong and that our economy is strong, because that's what's going to keep America great.
And real quickly, and then I'm going to go to the audience for sure. Are you, I can't think of any industry that lives under, rule of law globally and the importance of rulemaking than your industry. Is America agenda setting in rule of law in capital and finance secure, or is that being challenged?
No, I think, I think from a regulatory, since the financial crises, really, right? I mean, the actions of FSB and the G20 and the US, I think, we know what the regulatory regime is to a certain point. I think the fear is we're going to get more capital. requirements, and if you're going to get more capital requirements because
But
you're
I'm also
worried
wondering,
about
are
us,
we
but
being
that's a
challenged
different
globally?
issue.
Is China challenging us?
Well, I mean, it goes back to the question of the primacy of the dollar, right?
Right.
And are we worried that it's going to be undercut?
Jay, do you worry about the dollar?
Let him worry. I don't worry about
I'm
it.
paid to worry about the dollar,
Yeah.
but I mean, I think
You are
your
paid to
broader-
worry about the dollar?
It's part of my
a
portfolio,
great-
but only the Treasury Secretary talks about it, but I worry about it. But I mean, I think I would just agree that I think, look, at the end of the day, the U.S. is an open financial system. China is not. I don't see that as like a near-term risk. I would agree that the ability to work with allies, whether it's the G20, FSB, things like that, that's where the real standard setting is taking place, and I think that's appropriate.
Great. I want this to keep going because we're getting this
Can I
juicy.
say two
Yeah,
seconds?
yeah,
just
two
on
sentences,
sanctions?
and then we're going to go to a
I would
question
just
we have
note, when you're talking about sanctions and supply chains, I just think it's always important to note there. First of all, while I agree that unilateral sanctions can be problematic, that the most recent round of sanctions, especially around Russia's war in Ukraine, were very multilateral, and were deliberately crafted to avoid any implications for food or medical care or things like that. And most of all,
Are you surprised how resilient Russia has been?
Well, just one quick thing there. Any disruptions that took place are not because of the sanctions. They're because an autocratic government invaded a sovereign state.
No, I get that.
Right,
yeah.
and I think that's just an important starting point for us always to have on the table.
I agree with that. And the second thing, what I worry about is I have contacts in Russia, just how resilient the place is. I worry about Turkey and India, UAE, Brazil, backstop. So I worry a little bit about emotion and lack of efficaciousness, but that could be another panel down the road. Do you have a question for us? Yeah, great.
Hi, my name is Chris McLean. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. My question is around public-private partnerships, and you guys touched on it a little bit earlier, but it's clear that in global development, no one institution or country is going to be able to solve all of these challenges alone. But
Right.
So when it comes to tackling, climate, poverty, competitiveness all the way around in places like the Global South and what have you,
Right.
when it comes to marshaling the private sector, what is the economic case? How do you pitch the C-suite and boardrooms, to be able to put skin in the game on this?
Great, thank you. I'm going to start with Alice real quick, and we do real quick interventions here, and we'll probably have to wrap it up. But marshaling the private sector.
So I think if you're trying to make a case to your C-suite about it, I would look at the demographics, and let me talk about the continent of Africa. If you look at the growth rates and the percentage of those countries that are young, they're going to be a larger and larger percentage of the population by the end of this century. And many of the policy regimes in those countries are trying to build a middle class, and they're trying to acquire goods and services. And they want digitization, they want energy, they want education. The list goes on and on. So if you take a long view, the opportunity is huge. Now the question is how do we get there? And I think that we can all do a better and better job at working with the tools within the US government to figure out how to de-risk individual opportunities that are ahead of us more near term to build that flow of private capital in. I could go on and on, to be continued.
Right. We have about 15 seconds. Jay.
Yeah, I mean, I would just echo that point, demographics. If I'm pitching a C-suite, if you're not in Africa and parts of South Asia, you don't want to be in business in 2050, right? So I think it's pretty clear where growth is, and that was our message when we were in sub-Saharan Africa.
Right.
We're there because we see you as the future.
Right.
The next 50 years of the global economy, the history will be written in sub-Saharan Africa, and so you should be there if you want to be in business.
And Candy, you are the private sector, so how do you marshal more of yourself?
Well, to the point, I was going to say it's the demographics. We know we've been 50 years in Africa and 40 countries, and so, but de-risking,
Right.
having clarity, dealing with the rule of law. These countries need to develop their systems, and they need, expertise and guidance, and from people in the room that are going to help to get them to a point where it makes it more investable.
Well, please give a round of applause to Candy Wolf of Citi, Alice Albright of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, and Jay Shambaugh, who's worrying about the dollar at the Department of the Treasury. Thank you all.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.